Mechanisms resembling Lamarckism. Studies in the field of epigenetics, genetics and somatic hypermutation 105-106 have highlighted the possible inheritance of traits acquired by the previous generation. 107, 108, 109, 110, 111. However, the characterization of these findings as Lamarckism has been disputed. 112, 113, 114, 115. Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. DNA molecule with epigenetic marks, created by methylation, enabling a neo-Lamarckian pattern of inheritance for some generations. Epigenetic inheritance has been argued by scientists including Eva Jablonka and Marion J. Lamb to be Lamarckian. 116. Epigenetics is based on hereditary elements other than genes that pass into the germ cells. These include methylation patterns in DNA and chromatin marks on histone proteins, both involved in gene regulation. These marks are responsive to environmental stimuli, differentially affect gene expression, and are adaptive, with phenotypic effects that persist for some generations. The mechanism may also enable the inheritance of behavioral traits, for example in chickens, 117, 118, 119, rats, 120, 121, and human populations that have experienced starvation, DNA methylation resulting in altered gene function in both the starved population and their offspring. 122. Methylation similarly mediates epigenetic inheritance in plants such as rice. 123, 124, small RNA molecules, 2, may mediate inherited resistance to infection. 125, 126, 127. Handel and Ramagopalan commented that epigenetics allows the peaceful coexistence of Darwinian and Lamarckian evolution. 128. Joseph Springer and Dennis Hawley commented in 2013 that 6. Lamarck and his ideas were ridiculed and discredited. In a strange twist of fate, Lamarck may have the last laugh. Epigenetics, an emerging field of genetics, has shown that Lamarck may have been at least partially correct all along. It seems that reversible and heritable changes can occur without a change in DNA sequence, genotype, and that such changes may be induced spontaneously or in response to environmental factors, Lamarck's acquired traits. Determining which observed phenotypes are genetically inherited and which are environmentally induced remains an important and ongoing part of the study of genetics, developmental biology, and medicine. 6. The prokaryotic CRISPR system and Pewi interacting RNA could be classified as Lamarckian, within a Darwinian framework. 129, 130. However, the significance of epigenetics in evolution is uncertain. Critics such as the evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne point out that epigenetic inheritance lasts for only a few generations, so it is not a stable basis for evolutionary change. 131, 132, 133, 134. The evolutionary biologist T. Ryan Gregory contends that epigenetic inheritance should not be considered Lamarckian. According to Gregory, Lamarck did not claim that the environment directly affected living things. Instead, Lamarck argued that the environment created needs to which organisms responded by using some features more and others less, that this resulted in those features being accentuated or attenuated, and that this difference was then inherited by offspring. Gregory has stated that Lamarckian evolution in epigenetics is more like Darwin's point of view than Lamarck's. 112. In 2007, David Haig wrote that research into epigenetic processes does allow a Lamarckian element in evolution, but the processes do not challenge the main tenets of the modern evolutionary synthesis as modern Lamarckians have claimed. Haig argued for the primacy of DNA and evolution of epigenetic switches by natural selection. 135. Haig has written that there is a visceral attraction to Lamarckian evolution from the public and some scientists, as it posits the world with a meaning, in which organisms can shape their own evolutionary destiny. 136. Thomas Dickens and Kazi Rahman 2012 have argued that epigenetic mechanisms such as DNA methylation and histone modification are genetically inherited under the control of natural selection and do not challenge the modern synthesis. They dispute the claims of Jablonka and Lamb on Lamarckian epigenetic processes. 137. Edward J. Steele's disputed 138 neo-Lamarckian mechanism involves somatic hypermutation and reverse transcription by a retrovirus to breach the Weissman barrier to germline DNA. In 2015, Khurshid Iqbal and colleagues discovered that although endocrine disruptors exert direct epigenetic effects in the exposed fetal germ cells, these are corrected by reprogramming events in the next generation. 139. Also in 2015, Adam Weiss argued that bringing back Lamarck in the context of epigenetics is misleading, commenting, "We should remember Lamarck for the good he contributed to science, not for things that resemble his theory only superficially." Indeed, thinking of CRISPR and other phenomena as Lamarckian only obscures the simple and elegant way evolution really works. 140. Somatic hypermutation and reverse transcription to germline. In the 1970s, the Australian immunologist Edward J. Steele developed a neo-Lamarckian theory of somatic hypermutation within the immune system and coupled it to the reverse transcription of RNA derived from body cells to the DNA of germline cells. This reverse transcription process supposedly enabled characteristics or bodily changes acquired during a lifetime to be written back into the DNA and passed on to subsequent generations. 141, 142. The mechanism was meant to explain why homologous DNA sequences from the VDJ gene regions of parent mice were found in their germ cells and seemed to persist in the offspring for a few generations. The mechanism involved the somatic selection and clonal amplification of newly acquired antibody gene sequences generated via somatic hypermutation in B cells. The messenger RNA products of these somatically novel genes were captured by retroviruses endogenous to the B cells and were then transported through the bloodstream where they could breach the Weissman or soma germ barrier and reverse transcribe the newly acquired genes into the cells of the germ line, in the manner of Darwin's pangenes. 106, 105, 143. Neo-Lamarckian inheritance of hologenome, 144. The historian of biology Peter J. Bowler noted in 1989 that other scientists had been unable to reproduce his results, and described the scientific consensus at the time. 138. There is no feedback of information from the proteins to the DNA, and hence no route by which characteristics acquired in the body can be passed on through the genes. The work of Ted Steele 1979 provoked a flurry of interest in the possibility that there might, after all, be ways in which this reverse flow of information could take place. His mechanism did not, in fact, violate the principles of molecular biology, but most biologists were suspicious of Steele's claims, and attempts to reproduce his results have failed. 138. Bowler commented that Steele's work was bitterly criticized at the time by biologists who doubted his experimental results and rejected his hypothetical mechanism as implausible. 138. Hologenome theory of evolution. The hologenome theory of evolution, while Darwinian, has Lamarckian aspects. An individual animal or plant lives in symbiosis with many microorganisms, and together they have a hologenome consisting of all their genomes. The hologenome can vary like any other genome by mutation, sexual recombination, and chromosome rearrangement, but in addition it can vary when populations of microorganisms increase or decrease, resembling Lamarckian use and disuse, and when it gains new kinds of microorganism, resembling Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics. These changes are then passed on to offspring. 7th, the mechanism is largely uncontroversial, and natural selection does sometimes occur at whole system hologenome level, but it is not clear that this is always the case. 144. Lamarckian use and disuse compared to Darwinian evolution, the Baldwin effect, and Waddington's genetic assimilation. All the theories offer explanations of how organisms respond to a changed environment with adaptive inherited change. Baldwin effect. The Baldwin effect, named after the psychologist James Mark Baldwin by George Gaylord Simpson in 1953, proposes that the ability to learn new behaviors can improve an animal's reproductive success, and hence the course of natural selection on its genetic makeup. Simpson stated that the mechanism was not inconsistent with the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, 145, though he doubted that it occurred very often or could be proven to occur. He noted that the Baldwin effect provided a reconciliation between the neo-Darwinian and neo-Lamarckian approaches, something that the modern synthesis had seemed to render unnecessary. In particular, the effect allows animals to adapt to a new stress in the environment through behavioral changes, followed by genetic change. This somewhat resembles Lamarckism but without requiring animals to inherit characteristics acquired by their parents. 146. The Baldwin effect is broadly accepted by Darwinists. 147. In sociocultural evolution. Within the field of cultural evolution, Lamarckism has been applied as a mechanism for dual inheritance theory. 148. Gould viewed culture as a Lamarckian process whereby older generations transmitted adaptive information to offspring via the concept of learning. In the history of technology, components of Lamarckism have been used to link cultural development to human evolution by considering technology as extensions of human anatomy. Darwinism. Darwinism is a term used to describe a theory of biological evolution developed by the English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809-1882, and others. The theory states that all species of organisms arise and develop through the natural selection of small, inherited variations that increase the individual's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. Also called Darwinian theory, it originally included the broad concepts of transmutation of species or of evolution which gained general scientific acceptance after Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, including concepts which predated Darwin's theories. English biologist Thomas Henry Huxley coined the term Darwinism in April 1860. 1. Charles Darwin in 1868. Terminology. Darwinism subsequently referred to the specific concepts of natural selection, the Weissman barrier, or the central dogma of molecular biology. 2. Though the term usually refers strictly to biological evolution, creationists have appropriated it to refer to the origin of life or to cosmic evolution, that are distinct to biological evolution. 3. And therefore consider it to be the belief and acceptance of Darwin's and of his predecessors' work, in place of other concepts, including divine design and extraterrestrial origins. 4. 5. English biologist Thomas Henry Huxley coined the term Darwinism in April 1860. 6. It was used to describe evolutionary concepts in general, including earlier concepts published by English philosopher Herbert Spencer. Many of the proponents of Darwinism at that time, including Huxley, had reservations about the significance of natural selection, and Darwin himself gave credence to what was later called Lamarckism. The strict neo-Darwinism of German evolutionary biologist August Weismann gained few supporters in the late 19th century. During the approximate period of the 1880s to about 1920, sometimes called the eclipse of Darwinism, scientists proposed various alternative evolutionary mechanisms which eventually proved untenable. The development of the modern synthesis in the early 20th century, incorporating natural selection with population genetics and Mendelian genetics, revived Darwinism in an updated form. 7. While the term Darwinism has remained in use amongst the public when referring to modern evolutionary theory, it has increasingly been argued by science writers such as Olivia Judson, Eugenie Scott, and Carl Safina that it is an inappropriate term for modern evolutionary theory. 8, 9, 10. For example, Darwin was unfamiliar with the work of the Moravian scientist and Augustinian friar Gregor Mendel. 11. And as a result had only a vague and inaccurate understanding of heredity. He naturally had no inkling of later theoretical developments and, like Mendel himself, knew nothing of genetic drift, for example. 12, 13. In the United States and to some extent in the United Kingdom, creationists often use the term Darwinism as a pejorative term in reference to beliefs such as scientific materialism. 8. Huxley. As evolution became widely accepted in the 1870s, caricatures of Charles Darwin with the body of an ape or monkey symbolized evolution. 14. Huxley, upon first reading Darwin's theory in 1858, responded, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." 15. While the term Darwinism had been used previously to refer to the work of Erasmus Darwin in the late 18th century, the term as understood today was introduced when Charles Darwin's 1859 book On the Origin of Species was reviewed by Thomas Henry Huxley in the April 1860 issue of the Westminster Review. 16. Having hailed the book as a veritable Whitworth gun in the armory of liberalism, promoting scientific naturalism over theology, and praising the usefulness of Darwin's ideas while expressing professional reservations about Darwin's gradualism and doubting if it could be proved that natural selection could form new species. 17. Huxley compared Darwin's achievement to that of Nicolaus Copernicus in explaining planetary motion. What if the orbit of Darwinism should be a little too circular? What if species should offer residual phenomena, here and there, not explicable by natural selection? 20 years hence naturalists may be in a position to say whether this is, or is not, the case, but in either event they will owe the author of The Origin of Species an immense debt of gratitude. And viewed as a whole, we do not believe that, since the publication of von Bayer's Researches on Development, 30 years ago, any work has appeared calculated to exert so large an influence, not only on the future of biology, but in extending the domination of science over regions of thought into which she has, as yet, hardly penetrated. 6. These are the basic tenets of evolution by natural selection as defined by Darwin. 1. More individuals are produced each generation than can survive. 2. Phenotypic variation exists among individuals and the variation is heritable. 3. Those individuals with heritable traits better suited to the environment will survive. 4. When reproductive isolation occurs, new species will form. Other 19th century usage. Darwinism soon came to stand for an entire range of evolutionary, and often revolutionary, philosophies about both biology and society. One of the more prominent approaches, summed in the 1864 phrase, "survival of the fittest," by Herbert Spencer, later became emblematic of Darwinism even though Spencer's own understanding of evolution, as expressed in 1857, was more similar to that of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck than to that of Darwin, and predated the publication of Darwin's theory in 1859. What is now called social Darwinism was, in its day, synonymous with Darwinism, the application of Darwinian principles of struggle to society, usually in support of anti-philanthropic political agenda. Another interpretation, one notably favored by Darwin's half-cousin Francis Galton, was that Darwinism implied that because natural selection was apparently no longer working on civilized people, it was possible for inferior strains of people who would normally be filtered out of the gene pool to overwhelm the superior strains, and voluntary corrective measures would be desirable, the foundation of eugenics. In Darwin's day there was no rigid definition of the term Darwinism, and it was used by opponents and proponents of Darwin's biological theory alike to mean whatever they wanted it to in a larger context. The ideas had international influence, and Ernst Haeckel developed what was known as Darwinismus in Germany, although, like Spencer's evolution, Haeckel's Darwinism had only a rough resemblance to the theory of Charles Darwin, and was not centered on natural selection. 18. In 1886, Alfred Russel Wallace went on a lecture tour across the United States, starting in New York and going via Boston, Washington, Kansas, Iowa and Nebraska to California, lecturing on what he called Darwinism, without any problems. 19. In his book Darwinism, 1889, Wallace had used the term pure Darwinism which proposed a greater efficacy for natural selection. 2021, George Romanes dubbed this view as Wallaceism, noting that in contrast to Darwin, this position was advocating a pure theory of natural selection to the exclusion of any supplementary theory. 22-23, taking influence from Darwin, Romanes was a proponent of both natural selection and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The latter was denied by Wallace, who was a strict selectionist. 24, Romanes' definition of Darwinism conformed directly with Darwin's views and was contrasted with Wallace's definition of the term. 25. Contemporary usage. The term Darwinism is often used in the United States by promoters of creationism, notably by leading members of the intelligent design movement, as an epithet to attack evolution as though it were an ideology, an ism, based on philosophical naturalism, atheism, or both. 26. For example, in 1993, UC Berkeley law professor and author Philip E. Johnson made this accusation of atheism with reference to Charles Hodge's 1874 book What is Darwinism? 27. However, unlike Johnson, Hodge confined the term to exclude those like American botanist Asa Gray who combined Christian faith with support for Darwin's natural selection theory, before answering the question posed in the book's title by concluding, it is atheism. 28-29. Creationists use pejoratively the term Darwinism to imply that the theory has been held as true only by Darwin and a core group of his followers, whom they cast as dogmatic and inflexible in their belief. 30. In the 2008 documentary film Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, which promotes intelligent design, ID, American writer and actor Ben Stein refers to scientists as Darwinists. Reviewing the film for Scientific American, John Rennie says, the term is a curious throwback, because in modern biology almost no one relies solely on Darwin's original ideas. Yet the choice of terminology isn't random. Ben Stein wants you to stop thinking of evolution as an actual science supported by verifiable facts and logical arguments and to start thinking of it as a dogmatic, atheistic ideology akin to Marxism. 31. However, Darwinism is also used neutrally within the scientific community to distinguish the modern evolutionary synthesis, which is sometimes called neo-Darwinism, from those first proposed by Darwin. Darwinism also is used neutrally by historians to differentiate his theory from other evolutionary theories current around the same period. For example, Darwinism may refer to Darwin's proposed mechanism of natural selection, in comparison to more recent mechanisms such as genetic drift and gene flow. It may also refer specifically to the role of Charles Darwin as opposed to others in the history of evolutionary thought, particularly contrasting Darwin's results with those of earlier theories such as Lamarckism or later ones such as the modern evolutionary synthesis. In political discussions in the United States, the term is mostly used by its enemies. 32. Biologist E.O. Wilson at Harvard University described the term as being a rhetorical device to make evolution seem like a kind of faith, like Maoism. Scientists don't call it Darwinism. 33. In the United Kingdom, the term often retains its positive sense as a reference to natural selection, and for example British ethologist and evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins wrote in his collection of essays A Devil's Chaplain, published in 2003, that as a scientist he is a Darwinist. 34. In his 1995 book Darwinian Fairy Tales, Australian philosopher David Stove, 35, used the term Darwinism in a different sense from the above examples. Describing himself as non-religious and as accepting the concept of natural selection as a well-established fact, Stove nonetheless attacked what he described as flawed concepts proposed by some ultra-Darwinists. Stove alleged that by using weak or false ad hoc reasoning, these ultra-Darwinists used evolutionary concepts to offer explanations that were not valid. For example, Stove suggested that the sociobiological explanation of altruism as an evolutionary feature was presented in such a way that the argument was effectively immune to any criticism. English philosopher Simon Blackburn wrote a rejoinder to Stove, 36, though a subsequent essay by Stove's protege James Franklin, 37, suggested that Blackburn's response actually confirmed Stove's central thesis that Darwinism can explain anything. In more recent times, the Australian moral philosopher and Professor Peter Singer, who serves as the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University, has proposed the development of a Darwinian left, based on the contemporary scientific understanding of biological anthropology, human evolution, and applied ethics in order to achieve the establishment of a more equal and cooperative human society in accordance with the sociobiological explanation of altruism. 38. Esoteric usage. In evolutionary aesthetics theory, there is evidence that perceptions of beauty are determined by natural selection and therefore Darwinian, that things, aspects of people and landscapes considered beautiful are typically found in situations likely to give enhanced survival of the perceiving humans. Genes. 30. Modern synthesis, 20th century. The modern synthesis was the early 20th century synthesis of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and Gregor Mendel's ideas on heredity into a joint mathematical framework. Julian Huxley coined the term in his 1942 book, Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. The synthesis combined the ideas of natural selection, Mendelian genetics, and population genetics. It also related the broad-scale macroevolution seen by paleontologists to the small-scale microevolution of local populations. Several major ideas about evolution came together in the population genetics of the early 20th century to form the modern synthesis, including genetic variation, natural selection, and particulate Mendelian inheritance. 1. This ended the eclipse of Darwinism and supplanted a variety of non-Darwinian theories of evolution. The synthesis was defined differently by its founders, with Ernst Mayr in 1959, G. Ledyard Stebbins in 1966, and Theodosius Dobzhansky in 1974 offering differing basic postulates, though they all include natural selection, working on heritable variation supplied by mutation. Other major figures in the synthesis included E. B. Ford, Bernhard Rensch, Ivan Schmalhausen, and George Gaylord Simpson. An early event in the modern synthesis was R. A. Fisher's 1918 paper on mathematical population genetics, though William Bateson, and separately Edna Ewell, had already started to show how Mendelian genetics could work in evolution in 1902. Different syntheses followed, including with social behavior in E. O. Wilson's Sociobiology in 1975, Evolutionary Developmental Biology's integration of embryology with genetics and evolution, starting in 1977, and Massimo Pigliucci's and Gerd B. Muller's proposed extended evolutionary synthesis of 2007. In the view of evolutionary biologist Eugene Koonin in 2009, the modern synthesis will be replaced by a postmodern synthesis that will include revolutionary changes in molecular biology, the study of prokaryotes and the resulting tree of life, and genomics. 3. Developments leading up to the synthesis. Darwin's pangenesis theory. Every part of the body emits tiny gemmules which migrate to the gonads and contribute to the next generation via the fertilized egg. Changes to the body during an organism's life would be inherited, as in Lamarckism. Darwin's Evolution by Natural Selection, 1859. Charles Darwin's 1859 book, On the Origin of Species, convinced most biologists that evolution had occurred, but not that natural selection was its primary mechanism. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, variations of Lamarckism, inheritance of acquired characteristics, orthogenesis, progressive evolution, saltationism, evolution by jumps, and mutationism, evolution driven by mutations, were discussed as alternatives. Darwin himself had sympathy for Lamarckism, but Alfred Russel Wallace advocated natural selection and totally rejected Lamarckism. 5. In 1880, Samuel Butler labeled Wallace's view neo-Darwinism. 6. 7. Blending inheritance, implied by pangenesis, causes the averaging out of every characteristic, which, as the engineer Fleming Jenkin pointed out, would make evolution by natural selection impossible. The eclipse of Darwinism, 1880s onwards. From the 1880s onwards, biologists grew skeptical of Darwinian evolution. This eclipse of Darwinism, in Julian Huxley's words, grew out of the weaknesses in Darwin's account, with respect to his view of inheritance. Darwin believed in blending inheritance, which implied that any new variation, even if beneficial, would be weakened by 50% at each generation, as the engineer Fleming Jenkin noted in 1868. 8-9. This in turn meant that small variations would not survive long enough to be selected. Blending would therefore directly oppose natural selection. In addition, Darwin and others considered Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics entirely possible, and Darwin's 1868 theory of pangenesis, with contributions to the next generation, gemmules flowing from all parts of the body, actually implied Lamarckism as well as blending. 10, 11, 12. August Weismann's germplasm theory. The hereditary material, the germplasm, is confined to the gonads and the gametes. Somatic cells of the body develop afresh in each generation from the germplasm. Weismann's germplasm, 1892. August Weismann's idea, set out in his 1892 book Das Keimplasma, eine Theorie der Vererbung, the germplasm, a theory of inheritance, 13, was that the hereditary material, which he called the germplasm, and the rest of the body, the soma, had a one-way relationship. The germplasm formed the body, but the body did not influence the germplasm, except indirectly in its participation in a population subject to natural selection. If correct, this made Darwin's pangenesis wrong, and Lamarckian inheritance impossible. His experiment on mice, cutting off their tails and showing that their offspring had normal tails, demonstrated that inheritance was hard. He argued strongly and dogmatically, 15, for Darwinism and against Lamarckism, polarizing opinions among other scientists. This increased anti-Darwinian feeling, contributing to its eclipse. 16, 17. Disputed beginnings. Genetics, Mutationism and Biometrics, 1900–1918. William Bateson championed Mendelism. While carrying out breeding experiments to clarify the mechanism of inheritance in 1900, Hugo de Vries and Karl Correns independently rediscovered Gregor Mendel's work. News of this reached William Bateson in England, who reported on the paper during a presentation to the Royal Horticultural Society in May 1900. 1-8. In Mendelian inheritance, the contributions of each parent retain their integrity, rather than blending with the contribution of the other parent. In the case of a cross between two true breeding varieties such as Mendel's round and wrinkled peas, the first-generation offspring are all alike, in this case, all round. Allowing these to cross, the original characteristics reappear, segregation, about 3/4 of their offspring are round, 1/4 wrinkled. There is a discontinuity between the appearance of the offspring. De Vries coined the term allele for a variant form of an inherited characteristic. 19. This reinforced a major division of thought, already present in the 1890s, between gradualists who followed Darwin, and saltationists such as Bateson. 20. The two schools were the Mendelians, such as Bateson and de Vries, who favored mutationism, evolution driven by mutation, based on genes whose alleles segregated discretely like Mendel's peas, 21-22, and the biometric school, led by Karl Pearson and Walter Weldon. The biometricians argued vigorously against mutationism, saying that empirical evidence indicated that variation was continuous in most organisms, not discrete as Mendelism seemed to predict. They wrongly believed that Mendelism inevitably implied evolution in discontinuous jumps. 23-24. Karl Pearson led the biometric school. A traditional view is that the biometricians and the Mendelians rejected natural selection and argued for their separate theories for 20 years, the debate only resolved by the development of population genetics. 23-25. A more recent view is that Bateson, de Vries, Thomas Hunt Morgan and Reginald Punnett had by 1918 formed a synthesis of Mendelism and mutationism. The understanding achieved by these geneticists spanned the action of natural selection on alleles, alternative forms of a gene, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the evolution of continuously varying traits, like height, and the probability that a new mutation will become fixed. In this view, the early geneticists accepted natural selection but rejected Darwin's non-Mendelian ideas about variation and heredity, and the synthesis began soon after 1900. 26-27. The traditional claim that Mendelians rejected the idea of continuous variation is false. As early as 1902, Bateson and Saunders wrote that, if there were even so few as, say, 4 or 5 pairs of possible allelomorphs, the various homo and heterozygous combinations might, on seriation, give so near an approach to a continuous curve that the purity of the elements would be unsuspected. 28. Also in 1902, the statistician Udny Yule showed mathematically that given multiple factors, Mendel's theory enabled continuous variation. Yule criticized Bateson's approach as confrontational. 29. But failed to prevent the Mendelians and the biometricians from falling out. 30. Cassell's hooded rats, 1911. Starting in 1906, William Castle carried out a long study of the effect of selection on coat color in rats. The piebald or hooded pattern was recessive to the gray wild type. He crossed hooded rats with both wild and Irish types, and then back-crossed the offspring with pure hooded rats. The dark stripe on the back was bigger. He then tried selecting different groups for bigger or smaller stripes for 5 generations and found that it was possible to change the characteristics considerably beyond the initial range of variation. This effectively refuted de Vries's claim that continuous variation was caused by the environment and could not be inherited. By 1911, Castle noted that the results could be explained by Darwinian selection on a heritable variation of a sufficient number of Mendelian genes. 31, 32, 33. Morgan's fruit flies, 1912. Thomas Hunt Morgan began his career in genetics as a saltationist and started out trying to demonstrate that mutations could produce new species in fruit flies. However, the experimental work at his lab with the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster C, showed that rather than creating new species in a single step, mutations increased the supply of genetic variation in the population. 34. By 1912, after years of work on the genetics of fruit flies, Morgan showed that these insects had many small Mendelian factors, discovered as mutant flies, on which Darwinian evolution could work as if the variation was fully continuous. The way was open for geneticists to conclude that Mendelism supported Darwinism. 35. An obstruction. Woodger's positivism, 1929. The theoretical biologist and philosopher of biology Joseph Henry Woodger led the introduction of positivism into biology with his 1929 book Biological Principles. He saw a mature science as being characterized by a framework of hypotheses that could be verified by facts established by experiments. He criticized the traditional natural history style of biology, including the study of evolution, as immature science, since it relied on narrative. 36. Woodger set out to play the role of Robert Boyle's 1661 skeptical chemist, intending to convert the subject of biology into a formal, unified science, and ultimately, following the Vienna circle of logical positivists like Otto Neurath and Rudolf Carnap, to reduce biology to physics and chemistry. His efforts stimulated the biologist J.B.S. Haldane to push for the axiomatization of biology, and by influencing thinkers such as Huxley, helped to bring about the modern synthesis. 36. The positivist climate made natural history unfashionable, and in America, research and university-level teaching on evolution declined almost to nothing by the late 1930s. The Harvard physiologist William John Crozier told his students that evolution was no devil a science, you can't experiment with 2 million years. 37. The tide of opinion turned with the adoption of mathematical modeling and controlled experimentation in population genetics, combining genetics, ecology and evolution in a framework acceptable to positivism. 38. Elements of the synthesis. Fisher and Haldane's Mathematical Population Genetics, 1918-1930. In 1918, R.A. Fisher wrote, The Correlation Between Relatives on the Supposition of Mendelian Inheritance, 39, which showed how continuous variation could come from a number of discrete genetic loci. In this and other papers, culminating in his 1930 book The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, 40, Fisher showed how Mendelian genetics was consistent with the idea of evolution by natural selection. 41, d. In the 1920s, a series of papers by J.B.S. Haldane analyzed real-world examples of natural selection, such as the evolution of industrial melanism in peppered moths. 41, and showed that natural selection could work even faster than Fisher had assumed. 43. Both of these scholars, and others, such as Dobzhansky and Wright, wanted to raise biology to the standards of the physical sciences by basing it on mathematical modeling and empirical testing. Natural selection, once considered unverifiable, was becoming predictable, measurable, and testable. 44. De Beers embryology, 1930. The traditional view is that developmental biology played little part in the modern synthesis. 45. But in his 1930 book Embryos and Ancestors, the evolutionary embryologist Gavin de Beer anticipated evolutionary developmental biology. 46. By showing that evolution could occur by heterochrony. 47. Such as in the retention of juvenile features in the adult. 48. This, de Beer argued, could cause apparently sudden changes in the fossil record, since embryos fossilize poorly. As the gaps in the fossil record had been used as an argument against Darwin's gradualist evolution, de Beer's explanation supported the Darwinian position. 49. However, despite de Beer, the modern synthesis largely ignored embryonic development when explaining the form of organisms, since population genetics appeared to be an adequate explanation of how such forms evolved. 50. 51. E. Wright's Adaptive Landscape, 1932. Sewell Wright introduced the idea of a fitness landscape with local optima. The population geneticist Sewell Wright focused on combinations of genes that interacted as complexes, and the effects of inbreeding on small relatively isolated populations, which could be subject to genetic drift. In a 1932 paper, he introduced the concept of an adaptive landscape in which phenomena such as crossbreeding and genetic drift in small populations could push them away from adaptive peaks, which would in turn allow natural selection to push them towards new adaptive peaks. 41. 53. Wright's model would appeal to field naturalists such as Theodosius Dobzhansky and Ernst Mayr, who were becoming aware of the importance of geographical isolation in real-world populations. 43. The work of Fisher, Haldane and Wright helped to found the discipline of theoretical population genetics. 54. 55. 56. Dobzhansky's Evolutionary Genetics, 1937. Drosophila pseudoobscura, the fruit fly which served as Theodosius Dobzhansky's model organism. Theodosius Dobzhansky, an immigrant from the Soviet Union to the United States, who had been a postdoctoral worker in Morgan's fruit fly lab, was one of the first to apply genetics to natural populations. He worked mostly with Drosophila pseudoobscura. He says pointedly, Russia has a variety of climates from the Arctic to subtropical. Exclusively laboratory workers who neither possess nor wish to have any knowledge of living beings in nature were in a minority. 57. Not surprisingly, there were other Russian geneticists with similar ideas, though for some time their work was known to only a few in the West. His 1937 work Genetics and the Origin of Species, 58, was a key step in bridging the gap between population geneticists and field naturalists. It presented the conclusions reached by Fisher, Haldane, and especially Wright in their highly mathematical papers in a form that was easily accessible to others. 41-43 Further, Dobzhansky asserted the physicality, and hence the biological reality, of the mechanisms of inheritance, that evolution was based on material genes, arranged in a string on physical hereditary structures, the chromosomes, and linked more or less strongly to each other according to their actual physical distances on the chromosomes. As with Haldane and Fisher, Dobzhansky's Evolutionary Genetics, 59, was a genuine science, now unifying cell biology, genetics, and both micro and macroevolution. 44. His work emphasized that real-world populations had far more genetic variability than the early population geneticists had assumed in their models and that genetically distinct subpopulations were important. Dobzhansky argued that natural selection worked to maintain genetic diversity as well as by driving change. He was influenced by his exposure in the 1920s to the work of Sergei Chetverikov, who had looked at the role of recessive genes in maintaining a reservoir of genetic variability in a population, before his work was shut down by the rise of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union. 41-43 By 1937, Dobzhansky was able to argue that mutations were the main source of evolutionary changes and variability, along with chromosome rearrangements, effects of genes on their neighbors during development, and polyploidy. Next, genetic drift. He used the term in 1941, selection, migration, and geographical isolation could change gene frequencies. Thirdly, mechanisms like ecological or sexual isolation and hybrid sterility could fix the results of the earlier processes. 60. Ford's Ecological Genetics, 1940. E. B. Ford studied polymorphism in the scarlet ogre moth for many years. E. B. Ford was an experimental naturalist who wanted to test natural selection in nature, virtually inventing the field of ecological genetics. 61. His work on natural selection in wild populations of butterflies and moths was the first to show that predictions made by R. A. Fisher were correct. In 1940, he was the first to describe and define genetic polymorphism, and to predict that human blood group polymorphisms might be maintained in the population by providing some protection against disease. 61-62, his 1949 book Mendelism and Evolution, 63, helped to persuade Dobzhansky to change the emphasis in the third edition of his famous textbook Genetics and the Origin of Species from drift to selection. 64. Schmalhausen's Stabilizing Selection, 1941. Ivan Schmalhausen developed the theory of stabilizing selection, the idea that selection can preserve a trait at some value, publishing a paper in Russian titled, Stabilizing Selection and Its Place Among Factors of Evolution, in 1941 and a monograph Factors of Evolution, The Theory of Stabilizing Selection, 65, in 1945. He developed it from J. M. Baldwin's 1902 concept that changes induced by the environment will ultimately be replaced by hereditary changes, including the Baldwin effect in behavior. Following that theory's implications to the Darwinian conclusion, and bringing him into conflict with Lysenkoism, Schmalhausen observed that stabilizing selection would remove most variations from the norm, most mutations being harmful. 66, 67, 68 Dobzhansky called the work an important missing link in the modern view of evolution. 69. Huxley's Popularizing Synthesis, 1942. Julian Huxley presented a serious but popularizing version of the theory in his 1942 book Evolution, The Modern Synthesis. In 1942, Julian Huxley's serious but popularizing 71 book Evolution, The Modern Synthesis 2 introduced a name for the synthesis and intentionally set out to promote a synthetic point of view on the evolutionary process. He imagined a wide synthesis of many sciences, genetics, developmental physiology, ecology, systematics, paleontology, cytology, and mathematical analysis of biology, and assumed that evolution would proceed differently in different groups of organisms according to how their genetic material was organized and their strategies for reproduction, leading to progressive but varying evolutionary trends. 71. His vision was of an evolutionary humanism. 72. With a system of ethics and a meaningful place for man in the world grounded in a unified theory of evolution which would demonstrate progress leading to humanity at its summit. Natural selection was in his view a fact of nature capable of verification by observation and experiment, while the period of synthesis of the 1920s and 1930s had formed a more unified science. 72. Rivaling physics and enabling the rebirth of Darwinism. 72. However, the book was not the research text that it appeared to be. In the view of the philosopher of science Michael Ruse, and in Huxley's own opinion, Huxley was a generalist, a synthesizer of ideas, rather than a specialist. 70. Ruse observes that Huxley wrote as if he were adding empirical evidence to the mathematical framework established by Fisher and the population geneticists, but that this was not so. Huxley avoided mathematics, for instance not even mentioning Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. Instead, Huxley used a mass of examples to demonstrate that natural selection is powerful and that it works on Mendelian genes. The book was successful in its goal of persuading readers of the reality of evolution, effectively illustrating topics such as island biogeography, speciation, and competition. Huxley further showed that the appearance of long-term orthogenetic trends, predictable directions for evolution, in the fossil record were readily explained as allometric growth, since parts are interconnected. All the same, Huxley did not reject orthogenesis out of hand, but maintained a belief in progress all his life, with Homo sapiens as the endpoint, and he had since 1912 been influenced by the vitalist philosopher Henri Bergson, though in public he maintained an atheistic position on evolution. 70. Huxley's belief in progress within evolution and evolutionary humanism was shared in various forms by Dobzhansky, Meyer, Simpson and Stebbins, all of them writing about the future of mankind. Both Huxley and Dobzhansky admired the paleontologist priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Huxley writing the introduction to Teilhard's 1955 book on orthogenesis, The Phenomenon of Man. This vision required evolution to be seen as the central and guiding principle of biology. 72. Meyer's allopatric speciation, 1942. Ernst Mayr argued that geographic isolation was needed to provide sufficient reproductive isolation for new species to form. Ernst Mayer's key contribution to the synthesis was Systematics and the Origin of Species, published in 1942. 7.3. It asserted the importance of and set out to explain population variation in evolutionary processes including speciation. He analyzed in particular the effects of polytypic species, geographic variation, and isolation by geographic and other means. 74. Meyer emphasized the importance of allopatric speciation, where geographically isolated subpopulations diverge so far that reproductive isolation occurs. He was skeptical of the reality of sympatric speciation, believing that geographical isolation was a prerequisite for building up intrinsic, reproductive, isolating mechanisms. Meyer also introduced the biological species concept that defined a species as a group of interbreeding or potentially interbreeding populations that were reproductively isolated from all other populations. 41, 43, 75, 76. Before he left Germany for the United States in 1930, Meyer had been influenced by the work of the German biologist Bernhard Rensch, who in the 1920s had analyzed the geographic distribution of polytypic species, paying particular attention to how variations between populations correlated with factors such as differences in climate. 77, 78, 79. George Gaylord Simpson argued against the naive view that evolution such as of the horse took place in a straight line. He noted that any chosen line is one path in a complex branching tree, natural selection having no imposed direction. Simpson's Paleontology, 1944. George Gaylord Simpson was responsible for showing that the modern synthesis was compatible with paleontology in his 1944 book Tempo and Mode in Evolution. Simpson's work was crucial because so many paleontologists had disagreed, in some cases vigorously, with the idea that natural selection was the main mechanism of evolution. It showed that the trends of linear progression, in for example the evolution of the horse, that earlier paleontologists had used as support for neo-Lamarckism and orthogenesis did not hold up under careful examination. Instead, the fossil record was consistent with the irregular, branching, and non-directional pattern predicted by the modern synthesis. 41, 43. Society for the Study of Evolution, 1946. During World War II, Meyer edited a series of bulletins of the Committee on Common Problems of Genetics, Paleontology, and Systematics, formed in 1943, reporting on discussions of a synthetic attack on the interdisciplinary problems of evolution. In 1946, the committee became the Society for the Study of Evolution, with Meyer, Dobzhansky and Sewall Wright the first of the signatories. Meyer became the editor of its journal, Evolution. From Meyer and Dobzhansky's point of view, suggests the historian of science Betty Smokovitis, Darwinism was reborn, evolutionary biology was legitimized, and genetics and evolution were synthesized into a newly unified science. Everything fitted into the new framework, except heretics, like Richard Goldschmidt, who annoyed Meyer and Dobzhansky by insisting on the possibility of speciation by macromutation, creating hopeful monsters. The result was bitter controversy. 52. Speciation via polyploidy. A diploid cell may fail to separate during meiosis, producing diploid gametes, which self-fertilize to produce a fertile tetraploid zygote that cannot interbreed with its parent species. Stebbins' Botany, 1950. The botanist G. Ledyard Stebbins extended the synthesis to encompass botany. He described the important effects on speciation of hybridization and polyploidy in plants in his 1950 book Variation and Evolution in Plants. These permitted evolution to proceed rapidly at times, polyploidy in particular evidently being able to create new species effectively instantaneously. 41, 80. Definitions by the founders. The modern synthesis was defined differently by its various founders, with differing numbers of basic postulates, as shown in the table. Definitions of the modern synthesis by its founders, as they numbered them. Component Meyer 1959 Stebbins, 1966 Dobzhansky, 1974. Mutation. 1. Randomness in all events that produce new genotypes, e.g. mutation. 81. 1. A source of variability, but not of direction, 82. 1. Yields genetic raw materials, 83. Recombination. 1. Randomness in recombination, fertilization, 81. 2. A source of variability, but not of direction, 82. Chromosomal organization. 3. Affects genetic linkage, arranges variation in gene pool, 82. Natural selection. 2. Is only direction-giving factor, 81, 84, as seen in adaptations to physical and biotic environment, 81. 4 guides changes to gene pool 82. 2 constructs evolutionary changes from genetic raw materials 83. Reproductive isolation. 5 limits direction in which selection can guide the population 82. 3 makes divergence irreversible in sexual organisms 83. After the synthesis, evolutionary biology continued to develop with major contributions from workers including W. D. Hamilton, 85, George C. Williams, 86, E. O. Wilson, 87, Edward B. Lewis, 88, and others. Hamilton's Inclusive Fitness, 1964. In 1964, W. D. Hamilton published 2 papers on the genetical evolution of social behavior. These defined inclusive fitness as the number of offspring equivalents an individual rears, rescues or otherwise supports through its behavior. This was contrasted with personal reproductive fitness, the number of offspring that the individual directly begets. Hamilton, and others such as John Maynard Smith, argued that a gene's success consisted in maximizing the number of copies of itself, either by begetting them or by indirectly encouraging begetting by related individuals who shared the gene, the theory of kin selection. 85-89. Williams's Gene-Centered Evolution, 1966. In 1966, George C. Williams published Adaptation and Natural Selection, outlined a gene-centered view of evolution following Hamilton's concepts, disputing the idea of evolutionary progress, and after the synthesis, attacking the then widespread theory of group selection. Williams argued that natural selection worked by changing the frequency of alleles, and could not work at the level of groups. 86 Genocentered evolution was popularized by Richard Dawkins in his 1976 book The Selfish Gene and developed in his more technical writings. 92. Wilson's Sociobiology, 1975. Ant societies have evolved elaborate caste structures, widely different in size and function. In 1975, E. O. Wilson published his controversial 93 book Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, the subtitle alluding to the modern synthesis 87, as he attempted to bring the study of animal society into the evolutionary fold. This appeared radically new, although Wilson was following Darwin, Fisher, Dawkins and others. 87 Critics such as Gerhard Lenski noted that he was following Huxley, Simpson and Dobzhansky's approach, which Lenski considered needlessly reductive as far as human society was concerned. 94 By 2000, the proposed discipline of sociobiology had morphed into the relatively well-accepted discipline of evolutionary psychology. 87. Lewis Homeotic Genes, 1978. Evolutionary developmental biology has formed a synthesis of evolutionary and developmental biology, discovering deep homology between the embryogenesis of such different animals as insects and vertebrates. In 1977, recombinant DNA technology enabled biologists to start to explore the genetic control of development. The growth of evolutionary developmental biology from 1978, when Edward B. Lewis discovered homeotic genes, showed that many so-called toolkit genes act to regulate development, influencing the expression of other genes. It also revealed that some of the regulatory genes are extremely ancient, so that animals as different as insects and mammals share control mechanisms. For example, the PAX6 gene is involved in forming the eyes of mice and of fruit flies. Such deep homology provided strong evidence for evolution and indicated the paths that evolution had taken. 88. Later syntheses. In 1982, a historical note on a series of evolutionary biology books, F, could state without qualification that evolution is the central organizing principle of biology.